Hello everybody, my name is Ryan, and in this lesson I'm going to show you how to add a form into your document. So I've got a standard template and I'm linking to a CSS file called forms.css, and that is currently empty. So let's begin by going to W3 Schools and taking a look at the HTML tag reference. There are quite a number of different tags that we're going to be using, the most important of which is the form tag. So the form tag is specifying the beginning of the form and the ending of the form. It's a block level element that takes the full width of the page. And all form elements need to be somewhere in between this opening form tag and the closing form tag. You'll notice the form tag has various different attributes, the most important of which are the action and the method. So the action is used to specify the destination where the data will be sent to, and the method is how the information will be sent. So let's go ahead and quickly add the opening and closing form tag to our document. And we'll add an attribute of action, and I'm just going to put a HTML file there for now. Typically this would actually be a server-side script. You'll see in the example they use .asp. I normally would use .php, but it really depends on what type of server-side language you're running. So I'll use HTML for now. And then the method, I'll set that to be post. Next up is the label tag. The label tag is used to label the individual form elements so we know what to type into each element. It has an opening tag, and it has a closing tag, and it has a text value in between that opening and closing tag. It also has a for attribute, which we'll talk about just now. Now the purpose of the label tag is to tell the user what they should type into that particular form element. It also helps blind people because they have software called screen readers which read to them the labels so the user knows what to type in the box. So even if they can't see the form on the page, the labels assist them to know what to put into each box. So let's go ahead and add a label, and I'm going to create a label for the first name. Now we need a way in which the user can capture their first name. So in order to do that, we're going to need another tag known as the input tag. The input tag does not have a closing tag. It just has an opening tag. It does have a couple of different properties, including the type property. The type property is the most important because it tells us what type of information the user is going to be putting into the box. The most common type used is the text type. You'll recognize some of the others. For example, password is where if a user types something in, the text they type in will be hidden. You'll see there's also something called a checkbox and a radio button. Another popular one is the submit button. So let's start off by creating a text box. So I'm going to switch on over to my coding, and just beneath the label I'm going to add an input tag with a type of text. So if I refresh that, you'll actually see there's a little text box where you can type something in. Now we also need to give this text box a name. That is quite important. In fact, every form element should have a name, and that name should always be unique. The reason for the name is so that when we hit submit on the button, the information will be sent to the action of the form, typically a server-side script, and that server-side script will need to know which information belongs to which box. and that's what the name does. Now we can also give the label tag a for attribute, and then we can give the input tag an ID attribute. So your for and your ID go together, kind of links the label to the input box. So when it sees this name being first name and this name being first name, the label and the box are linked together. So then we can do things like click on the label and the cursor will be placed into the box. So I always like to add a for attribute into each label and an ID attribute into each input. So next up is I like to have the label above the input box. And the reason for this is that on a mobile device, your screen width will be much narrower. And in order to see everything nicely, we prefer having the label above the box. So in order to do this, we're going to create some CSS. And I'm going to say label. And I'm going to set the display property of the label to be block. We haven't really spoken about the display property, but we have mentioned the fact that there are block elements and there are inline elements, and by default label is an inline element. So I'm now turning it into a block element. So if I refresh, you'll notice that the label is now above the input box. Okay, so let's now add some more form elements. I'm going to do a password element next. So we'll have label, this time for the password. And now we're going to have a value of password. And beneath that, we're going to do our input tag again. This time the type is going to be password rather than text. We'll still give it an ID and we'll still give it a name. So there we have the password box. Notice when I type inside of it, it hides the characters that I'm typing, whereas the type of text does not. Some other things that we can add to the input tag would be a size. So notice if I specify a size of 10, it would allow me to fit approximately 10 characters into the box before it starts scrolling. And then I can also specify a max length. The order of these attributes does not matter. So if I set the max length to be 10 and the size to be 10, it means that it will not scroll. When it gets to 10 characters, it will stop. So I'm going to just make this 20 for now, and I'm going to set the max length to 20. Okay, so I can type 20 characters and then it will stop. Max length is useful for forcing the user to a specific maximum number of characters. And we can also supply a max length for the password, as well as the size. Okay, I'm just going to leave out the size, because the size defaults to 20 anyway. Another property that we can add here is a checkbox. So I'm going to firstly create a label, and I'm going to give it a value of newsletter. And then I'm going to insert a checkbox. So it will be input type equal to checkbox. We'll give it a name and a value. The value will not display, but it will be sent through to the server. So now we have a little checkbox that we can tick or untick. So let me now do a text area. A text area is a much larger box where we can input information. We typically use this for a comments field. So let's add a label again. And then the text area tag is quite different from the input tag. So let's go have a look at that. The input tag doesn't have a closing tag, but the text area tag does. So you'll see the opening text area and the closing text area. There's also a rows property and a cols property. There are other properties as well, but rows and cols are the most important. So let's go ahead and add that in. So I have text area. Notice the closing tag. We'll give it rows. See, there's 10 rows. So it's kind of like your height. I normally use about 3 rows. And you can also specify the cols. So cols is very much similar to size on a text box. So it's normally how many characters you can fit per line, approximately. Then it's also a good idea to specify the name. Remember, each element must have a unique name. And then you can also put in a max length if you want to limit the user to a certain number of characters. So now if I type, when I get to 50 characters, it should stop. Notice that the user can have the option to drag the box bigger or smaller if they desire to do so. Also, if they exceed the size of the box, it will add scroll bars and start scrolling. So we typically use the text area for comments. I forgot to insert my label, so let me just add that in. There we go. Now the user knows exactly what they should type into the box. So let me show you an example of radio buttons. Radio buttons, we normally need at least 2 of them in a set. And you can only select one of the 2. So let's go and create a label. I'll use gender as an example here. So I will first put in the radio button. So input type equal to radio. And then I will give it a name of gender and a value of male. And I'm just going to write here male next to it. And then I will duplicate that line and just change the value to female. Notice that the name will still be the same. By giving both male and female the same name, it puts them into the same set, which means the user can only select one of the 2 of them. So let's have a look. So now I can select either male or I can select female. Not both. If I gave them 2 different names, then I would be able to select both at the same time. But that kind of defeats the purpose. You can add as many radio buttons as you want to a set. They just must all have exactly the same name. Next up, we're going to do a drop down. So for a drop down, so I'm going to switch back to the tag reference on W3 Schools and show you another tag now called select. And this is what we use to do a drop down. So there's an opening tag and there's a closing tag. And within the select, there are several options for each option in the drop down. So let's do an example of this. So after my gender, I'm going to start another label. I'll make this the country this time. And then I'm going to have a select. Let's see if we can see a preview while we're busy. So notice now I've got country and I've got an empty drop down. Now I'm going to start adding options to the drop down. Okay, I've got one option, South Africa. Let's add another option. Maybe one or two more. So there's a couple of different countries. If you want to, sometimes what we do is we just make an empty option that says select one, just to tell the user that they're supposed to select one of them. So in that way your first option just says select one, and then they can actually go and select one. Alright, so these are the most popular different types of input boxes. Next up is, how do we supply a default value to each of these boxes? So we can, for example, just add a value attribute into our input tag over here. And notice how it already filled that value in, pre-populated. So when the page loads, that value is already filled into the box. And this is only normally used when you want to edit your profile. If you're filling out a blank form, you typically have no need for a value. With a password box, you can't specify a default value because obviously it's hidden. With the checkbox, you can get it to check the checkbox by default. And the way we do that is we just add a special property to the checkbox called checked. If I refresh, notice the box is checked automatically when the page loads. So if you need your checkbox to automatically be checked, just put in the check property into your input tag. I'm going to leave it out for now. The check property can also be used on a radio button. So for example, if we want female to be selected automatically, we will just put the checked property into that input tag. Notice how it's now being selected automatically. And then if you want a specific value to be selected automatically from the drop down, let's say Germany, you would just put the selected property into that option, and that property that will also be auto-selected. Other nice features is we can add a placeholder attribute. Now placeholder is used to put some placeholder text. You'll see it's kind of grayed out text, and as soon as you click inside the box and you start typing, it disappears. But if I backspace, it reappears again. So this is useful, for example, to give clues to the user as to what they're supposed to enter. Maybe the format of a telephone number or something like that. Okay, I'm now going to add a submit button. So I'll just have input type equal to submit, and I'll give it a value of submit. And notice how it's created that submit button. I actually want to put the submit button on the next line, so I'm just going to create a style sheet for it. So I'm saying input with a type attribute of submit. So you may not have come across the square bracket syntax before. It just means property or attribute. So look for an input tag with an attribute of type that has a value of submit. And then we're going to just make it a block element. So I'm going to say display block. And you'll see it's now placed it below the drop down. Okay, the next thing we could maybe do is improve the spacing a little bit here. And the way to do that is maybe to use div tags around the label and value pairs. Let's see if we can do that. So I'm going to just take a combination of the label and the input tag, and I'm going to wrap it with the div tag, and I'm going to give it a class of okay, let me just try that again. So I'm using the emit feature here called wrap with abbreviation, and that gives me a little box at the bottom. And then by using emit, I can actually just say dot, that will create a div with a class, and I'll give it a value of form group, form-group. You can of course call it whatever you want. So now I've got an opening div and a closing div surrounding the label and the input tag. And I'm going to do the same now for the password. And I'm going to do the same for each and every one of these. So checkbox. And then the comments as well. The gender. And then I think I need to also do it for the country. Okay, so you'll see nothing's actually changed, but that's where the CSS is going to come in, because what we're going to do is we're just going to create a class for form group and maybe set a margin of a couple of pixels. I think I'm going to spell form group correctly. So notice now it's added a margin beneath each one. So it looks a bit better. You might want to go a little bit more, maybe 10 pixels. Let's go 8 pixels. Okay, then how else can we jack up our form? So maybe we can put a border around it. Let's make it 2 pixels dotted red. Let's make it nice and big. So I definitely now need some padding in between the form and the border. So let's add that in. Okay, that's much better. And then I could also set the width of the form to make it a bit neater. Let's set it to 400 pixels. Okay, and then it looks a lot better. We could also change the look of the boxes. So input, text area, select, maybe put a border. It's a bit too thick. Let's make it 1 pixel. So now we're kind of getting the same look and feel. We could also set the font size. The bigger you make the font size, the bigger you make the boxes. Perhaps we want to add a bit of padding so that the text is not touching the edges. And then of course you want to style the label. Maybe the font we can set to Arial. So there's several changes one can make to try and improve the look and feel of everything. Okay, so if I click submit now, it tries to post to submit.html. Because I'm not running on a real server, I can't do that at this point in time, but that will actually send the information to that page. So a couple of other new features in HTML5, some other nice form fields. We could also have, let's say, an email address. I'll just duplicate that and set that to email. We'll just take out the placeholder. So it looks the same as text, but on a mobile device it would actually change the keyboard to have a little @ sign on the keyboard, which is quite useful. Also, if we try and submit the form, it will complain if I've got an invalid email address. I gotta set the type to email though before that will work correctly. Let's try that again. Type something in, press submit, and then it complains. It's only basic validation, but it's quite nice that it's built in. So I would actually have to go and put in a proper email address and then submit, and then it would allow it. But even if I leave out one of the dots, for example, it's gonna it accepts it. So it's not perfect, but it definitely requires an @ sign. Okay, some other types of new elements we have in HTML5, one of which is the input type equals date. Notice that it actually gives us a little calendar, which is quite nice because then the user can actually choose the date from a little calendar. This is not supported in all browsers though, so for browsers that do not support it, it will just show a standard text box. If you want to see what browsers do support what, on the W3 School site you can go to HTML, and under the tutorial there's a section on forms. So if I go to the tutorial on forms, see if I can find it. Here we go. You'll see HTML5 elements. So these are all the new elements. Actually, I want the form elements. So here it goes through all of the different ones that are new. So let me just show you a couple of them. We need the, let's go input types. Here we go. So under input types, under HTML forms, it will give you a list of all the different form types. So let's see some of the new ones. Here's all the new ones. Okay, so input type equals number is quite nice. Here it tells you which browsers are supported. Here's the date one we looked at just now. You'll notice that Firefox does not support it. All the other browsers do support it. So in Firefox, if I have to look at the same thing, I won't see a calendar here. me just open up Firefox and then I'll give you a demonstration. Okay, so while that's busy, let's also now look at the input type equals number. Because what's nice about this is you can specify a minimum value and a maximum value. Okay, here's Firefox. Let me just quickly demonstrate this. Okay, so you'll see that the date does not have a calendar if I use Firefox, but it just defaults to using a normal text box. So just bear that in mind when you're using some of these new elements. Just check which browser is supported. Okay, let's now move on to the number. This one's supported by all of them, so it's worthwhile using this one. What's nice about it is you can specify a minimum value and a maximum value. So let's provide a place for them to enter their age. So it will be age. Oh, this should have been email. Input type equals number. Age is the ID. Name will be age. Doesn't have a max length property, but we can specify a min and a max property. So before I do that, let me just show you what it looks like. So here you see you've got a little combo box where you can change the number, and you see it won't let me type in a letter. It only lets me type in a number, so it's quite intelligent. Also on a mobile device, the keyboard will automatically switch over to a numeric keypad, which is great. So if you want to limit the values, you can use a min and a max attribute. So say min 10, max 20. When I refresh, the value for the age starts at 10, goes up to 20 and can't go further than that. That's a great new feature. Another nice HTML5 element is the color. So let's give this one a try. So we would say select your color, and then it gives us a little color palette to choose from. I'll call it color. Now the type needs to be color as well, but it needs to be spelled in the American way without the U. It doesn't have a min and a max value. It just has a name, an ID, and a type. Alright, let's have a look at this. You see it gives me a little color selector, and then I can choose a color, and it actually works out the HTML hex code for me. And I can just press enter, and it's now got that hex code in there. So when you submit, it will actually submit the hex code. So another great HTML5 input element. And then some of these others are a bit more experimental, but always remember to check which browsers support which features. Okay, so I think that gives us the most important input elements. So that kind of brings us to the end of looking at forms in HTML.